Hello, Mr. Sherrow.
Hi, how you doing?
Very well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Having some connection issues, but
Oh, that's
so
okay.
far it's holding up.
We'll work through it. It's all good. Um, just if you want to tell my cave dweller community a little about yourself.
Sure. I was raised here in Oregon, and when I was 8 years old, I decided I was going to study primates in the wild, and so I stayed on that track all through college and grad school, and finished up getting a PhD in anthropology and evolutionary anthropology, focused on primate and human evolution and behavior, and taught for about 7 years at Ohio University, and then got really burned out on academia and got really kind of tired of spinning my wheels in faculty meetings that weren't going anywhere. And it just wasn't the right fit. And so loaded up the family and moved back to the West Coast and did a lecture tour, and have since been writing quite a bit on human behavior and doing some studies. And so now I'm an independent consultant and consult for nonprofits in the area, as well as do political campaigns, kind of helping people cut through the bull and deliver powerful messages. And all kind of using that background and training that I got in grad school, just in a completely different way than what I planned.
Had myself on mute. Sorry. I know one of your, I guess you can call it one of your babies is you. It's called You Evolving.
Yeah, that's my consultant company, You Evolving, and it's just you-evolving.com on the web. And I do, like I said, I consult for organizations, mostly nonprofits, but do campaign work. And then I consult for individuals too, like folks who want to become more effective leaders in their organizations, things like that.
Very good. Now, so you said, you mentioned something about studying everything from humans to grizzly bears to chimpanzees. That's a pretty, well, I want to say pretty broad spectrum, but I mean, I guess in the realm of things outside of grizzly bears, it's not that it's not that wide, I guess.
Yeah, I've stayed mostly with large mammals, but as a kid growing up in Oregon, when I said I want to be a primatologist, my teachers and counselors at my schools didn't even know what that was. And so I took every opportunity I could. When I was an undergrad, I studied semi-captive dog behavior. They were in these big runs, and we'd take them out and do trials with them. And then took off on a grizzly bear and gray wolf study over the summer, one summer, just so I could get some field experience collecting data out in the field and dealing with life in the field. And then was fortunate enough to get an internship with the Cheetah Conservation Fund down in Namibia in Southern Africa when I was working on my first master's. And so took off and did that. And while I was there, got to study the baboons in the area and do a bunch of work in the schools, and as well as doing direct stuff with the cheetahs. And that just kind of broadened my perspective. So while I was studying and working on my dissertation and doing the good grad student work, I also led a few safaris and became a little bit of a I would call myself a well-versed novice in African animals. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, I've got a chance, did a Fulbright in Indonesia where I studied gibbons, and so just got a chance to travel the world in a different way than a lot of people do who come from a small town, and took every opportunity I could and worked my butt off to get those opportunities.
I wanted to ask you, and I've never asked my guests before. What does that Fulbright mean? Fulbright scholar. What does it? For my own knowledge, I have no clue.
Sure. So the Fulbright is a U.S. government scholarly award. So
Okay.
you apply for it. You go through kind of a rigorous process where you have to write essays and then get interviewed by former Fulbright scholars. And basically, what it is if they determine that you meet high enough academic standards, that you're and probably as importantly, that you'll be a good representative of the US going abroad, then you get selected to go, and sometimes you get the country of your choice. I was fortunate; I had a specific project that I wanted to do, and not a lot of people want to go to Indonesia for their Fulbright. I actually showed up there. I think we got there about 6 weeks after the fall of Suharto, um, and we actually were advised that if we were out on the streets and things started to get weird, to pretend we were Canadian, because nobody has a problem with Canadians, I guess. So yeah, it's just it's an academically oriented scholarship that sends you overseas for an entire year to live in a different country, and do typically an academic project.
Very good. Yeah, I was always wondering what that was, and I always forgot to ask because there was other questions, but I had that one written down to ask you, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Now, one of your in some of your things online, you were so it was in Africa or Indonesia that you were charged by elephants.
Oh, Africa. Um, the big elephants.
Oh,
Yeah, the savanna elephants, that live actually in some of the forests in Africa. So there's two different species in Africa. There's the smaller forest elephant and then the big savanna elephant. And the savanna elephant actually travels through forests on its way between different grasslands. And they can be pretty cantankerous. You come across them and they can have a bad attitude. And the thing is, even if they're just moving, they're so large that if you get in their way, it's really easy to get injured without them trying to do anything to
yeah.
you. And I mean, in my case, each time it was as much or more my fault than it was the elephants. It was situations where you're walking through grasslands where the grass is 14 feet high and you're pushing it out of the way, trying to find a new trail, and typically those trails are elephant trails.
Okay.
And each time I happened to come across an elephant that I knew was up in front of me, but I couldn't tell exactly where, and it just so happened that it was moving towards me while I was moving towards it. And you know two different times came through the grass and pushed it aside, and suddenly here's a huge set of ears and a trunk goes up trumpeting, and I mean, in that case, you just turn around and run as fast as you can.
Hope they run slower, I guess, right?
Well, and I mean, the thing, it's not, I wouldn't call it something to rely on, but they don't really want to hurt you. They have no
Right.
reason to.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like an elephant's going to eat you. So, typically they just want to do a little display and get you, whatever you are, get you far away. Because also remember that this is an area where elephants are poached. So, the last 5 years I was working in Uganda, we had 7 elephants get poached inside of 5 years. The previous 10 years before that, 0 poaching. So it was on the rise. And that's where it's most dangerous. They get caught out in the open, and people with high powered rifles, a lot of times assault rifles, AK-47s that have been shipped in the black market and given to people specifically to collect ivory. They get caught by humans that have those, and that's a bad day for the elephant. So I don't
Yeah.
blame them one bit when they come across a human of scare it away, get it away as fast as I can.
Yeah, then that's a shame to watch. 'Cause I'm sure like everyone else, I've watched those documentaries and everything about that, the rhinos, and it's just there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of amazing work to protect them. Definitely, it's a shame to see that that still goes on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think one of the worst parts of it is, I mean, I think one, you have, people who are collecting the ivory for all sorts of reasons that don't have any basis in reality of medicinal purposes or things like that, or just simply as an ornament, um, which is just as bad in my mind. But one of the worst things is, they'll take one of these huge bull elephants with great tusks, they chop the tusks off, and they just leave the entire body. And so, while yes, there are scavengers of all sorts of levels in the forest that feed off that body, that's a lot of meat that is not being utilized, that, and you're in an area where people are starving. And so just that kind of trade for money makes me even angrier.
Yeah,
um
I agree. So you talk about how you got you knew at the age of 8 that that's the direction you wanted to go. What was it that led you? I mean, what happened that you just wanted to do that?
well, there's a story to it, of course, and it's a pretty common one among people around my age. um when I was 8 years old, my mom gave me a National Geographic magazine with Jane Goodall on the cover, and I poured through that magazine over and over. I mean, I probably wore the pages out reading that article over and over. And I told my parents, I said, that's what I'm going to do. And at 8, my parents said, sure. Last week you were going to be a fireman, and before that
Right.
a doctor. And and I was like, no, that's what I'm going to do. And I just stuck to it. And it's amazing. Since I've been in this field, I've met probably a half a dozen people who have a similar story. You know, saw a Jane Goodall documentary. My parents gave me a Jane Goodall book. I got to see her speak, and I was like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. And she's been an amazing inspiration to an entire generation of scientists. Just phenomenal. I've been fortunate to meet her a couple of times in person, and yeah, she's even more wonderful in person. She's one of those people where you go, what's wrong with you, really? There's got to be something somewhere. Just genuinely good hearted, and a good scientist, and an incredibly strong woman. I have daughters, and I love that they consider her one of their heroes. um yeah, she's fantastic.
Very good. Yeah, I figured there had to be a story to want to do it that young.
Oh yeah.
And obviously that led you to your anthropology and everything. So uh, what I guess is the main focus of an evolutionary anthropologist? So what is it that you mostly focus on? Yeah, a lot
how
of
long
them,
how long do you have for this
huh?
podcast?
Hey, as long as you want, but
um, because the thing about evolutionary anthropology, and it's sometimes called biological anthropology, used to be called physical anthropology. We've gotten away from that title. That title is not really accurate in any way. I use evolutionary anthropology because, so in our subfield of anthropology, anthropology is made up of these different subfields. The biggest one being the cultural anthropologists, the folks who go and live with other people for a year or to plus, and learn all about them and their culture, and then kind of report on it. Then you have your archaeologists. You're typically dealing with physical remains. Usually a lot of things like home sites and things like that. And they tell us a ton about our prehistory, and really fill in a lot of the gaps, I've been fortunate to have some good friends that are archaeologists to do some amazing work. And same with cultural anthropologists. And then There's kind of a little subset, the linguistic anthropologists, and they study languages and the evolution of language and the development of those over time. And then there are the biological or evolutionary anthropologists, and we are the most. We have, I would say, within us the most varied group because it's everything from forensic anthropology. So even though I didn't think this show was a very good depiction of it, like in Bones, that's based on an actual forensic anthropologist. Um, and there are your folks that, we used to do this in grad school. The cops would call us and say, "Hey, we got some bones out here and we need to determine if they're human or not." And we go out, and for like $50 a call, you go out and identify whether or not they're human, and tells them if they have a potential crime scene, or if it's just somebody's goat that died out in the field. And so you got your forensic anthropologists, you've got human growth and development people who are studying everything from hormones to literally how children grow and develop. You've got your primatologists, and then you've got kind of the rock stars, the paleoanthropologists, those human evolution folks, and the folks who actually study what this show is named after, Neanderthals, as well as lots of other species. And I like to call them the rock stars because they're the ones that it takes them forever to get that kind of one hit, but when they get that one hit, they're on the cover of Time. And I think rightfully so. If you find something that's 5.5 million years old and looks like it could be an ancestor for humans, that's pretty awesome stuff. But the thing that ties all of those different fields of study together is that we all look at humans through an evolutionary lens. So we're all looking at the evolution of humans and our relatives, and that's why I call it evolutionary anthropology.
Very good. I appreciate that. Now, the one thing that you wanted to share with was, and the way you wrote it was, when scientists talk about the evolutionary reason for a behavior, they're not assigning merit to that behavior or condoning it. They're just simply finding the source of it. It's up to us as individuals and as groups and societies to determine what is morally acceptable and hold individuals to those standards. So what, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all.
Sure. And this is something that is kind of hitting the news now. There are a couple recent books that want to talk about our prehistoric minds and how we're evolved to behave in certain ways. And there's lots of kind of, oh, this behavior happens because we evolved to do this and this and this. And first off, I want to say that that's incredibly difficult to determine.
Sure.
A lot of those really are what I like to call time machine questions. Unless you figured out a time machine and can go back and watch what's going on, it's going to be almost impossible in most situations to say this happens because of this. I'll give you an example. I just finished writing a guest blog for a gentleman here locally, and he gets a pretty good distribution on it. And he asked me to write something on the recent laws in Texas and the attempts by what are male administrations to kind of control female behavior. And he said, because that sounds a lot like what a lot of male primates do. And I said, yeah, it does, but there's all sorts of cultural layers there. And so I laid out a scenario saying this could be one of the reasons, but I wouldn't say this happens because of this, and this. So that's the first thing. It's really difficult to do that. And then I think when scientists are trying to find the evolutionary roots of a behavior, they really are just genuinely trying to find out, okay, how did that behavior come about as a regular practice by any species? So for example, chimpanzees that I've been fortunate enough to spend over 3,500 hours in the field with them now, something like that. They, males get together in groups and defend territories. Okay, well, that's a really interesting behavior for these individual males to take on. And it's an interesting question just how that came about. Now, there are folks who would watch them go about these behaviors, and on those, when they patrol these territories, if they find neighbors, if they find other chimps, they attack them. They try to kill them. If they can, they isolate them, and if they're males, they isolate them and kill them if they can. They'll kill infants from other communities. And there are people who put a value judgment on that and say, oh, look at that, that's so terrible. But that's not what the scientists researching them are trying to do. And so, in fairness, if you're trying to study human behavior, you want to go about it the same way. You want to try and get at what's the source of this behavior. Is it something that is just, part of the culture and there is no evolutionary reason for it? That doesn't mean that it's, again, there's no value on it. That doesn't mean it's a better or worse behavior or lesser behavior or anything like that. It just means that you're getting to the source of it. And I think too often it's just easy for us to, because we are maybe impacted by these behaviors, I would say it's easy for us to identify with them and therefore hard for us to be objective about them and say, oh, well, humans everywhere around the world, males kill other males at higher rates than any other demographic. Well, why is that? Is it just because in all those cultures males happen to be more aggressive, or is there something deeper there? And that's what we're interested in, is there something deeper there?
So then with that, I guess talking in regards to that, would you say, because of course there's always the question on, what caused the demise of our Neanderthal cousins or ancestors. So I have, would you say integration or degradation in a sense? Did we integrate them or did we destroy them? What would you, but just your opinion, obviously.
Yeah. And it's something that I've looked at a few times, and honestly, this is one of those where it's a beautiful case of how science works. Because just in my time studying this particular subject and studying evolutionary anthropology, the agreed upon understanding has changed. So because we've gotten more data. So we used to think that we completely replaced Neanderthals, that modern humans, everywhere they went in, they basically probably outcompeted them. There were those folks who were like, oh, it was open warfare, and they wiped them out. Maybe in some cases, in other cases, humans were probably just more efficient at gathering food, spent less energy doing that, had a much wider diet that they could get food from, so their kids survived at higher rates, and over time replaced. That was the thinking back then. Since then, thanks to beginning with Svante Pabo at the Max Planck Institute, a brilliant geneticist and his team, and now dozens of teams since then, we now know that it's much, much more complicated and muddier than that. And I'll say this too. I think the reality is, in most cases, it is muddled and muddy and messy, and that's how biology typically is. There are very few times where, oh, it's just really simple. Modern humans moved in and Neanderthals couldn't compete and died out. Now we know, oh no, there was some interbreeding. There, and probably for a long period of time, there almost certainly were cases where there was some sort of, I don't know if I want to use the term war because that's got special connotations to it, but where there were conflicts that were deadly. um there probably were situations where they lived side by side for years. They just figured out not to go over that hill and mess with those other human looking things. um and and so I think we probably have a mixture of all of that. But I think the thing that probably, in my opinion, that probably holds true is that the creativity of humans, of Homo sapiens, of our species, in all sorts of ways, and being able to plan for the future, and being able to see resources where other hominins, our relatives, couldn't see them. So things like exploiting shorelines, and understanding that birds' eggs were as good as catching the bird, and things like that. I think all of that kind of plays into this, where yeah, modern humans probably were more adaptive. I mean, they certainly were more adaptive than Neanderthals. Neanderthals were almost a niche species, that was built for a glacial environment, that really, and even though we have Neanderthal remains that are outside of that realm, they're the fringe populations. The core of Neanderthals were an ice age population. And so yeah, I think it's hard to say one or the other. I think it's almost certainly a combination of, you get this kind of interbreeding, and then at the same time, but the ones, and you could think of it in this way: if you've got successful interbreeding going both directions, so meaning that if it's a male Neanderthal and a female human, it's a success. If it's a male human and a female Neanderthal, it's a success. If the babies being raised by modern humans are surviving at higher rates, then even the ones that are interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals are surviving at higher rates in those human populations. And so they're picking up the human traits, as well as carrying the genes. And so I think probably you got a mix there. I've often wondered what it would be like if the Geico commercials were real, and Neanderthals were still hanging around. Uh, it'd be a whole different world, that's for sure.
Yeah, it definitely would be. And I always get to the point too with my guests about, even to this day, with all the discoveries, of what our well, you say Neanderthal, does it matter to you, in tall or thal?
I don't care. It's just
Okay,
it's how I was trained because of the
that's
German
fine.
pronunciation.
Um, it's like there still is, and I think it's starting to wane a little bit, but there's always been a stereotype of, the Neanderthals were just lugheads, just complete idiots that didn't know anything about surviving. And I can't, for the life of me, I can't figure out why. First of all, we thought that because they survived for hundreds of thousands of years, but why do we still put them in a box, as to, well, they weren't that intelligent, like, to me, if we would, if the, the researchers and everybody would open their mind a little more, saying, well, they're not as dumb as we thought they were. Okay, so I guess a couple parts. Do you think there would be more discoveries if we took the Neanderthal out of that box and said, well, they were pretty smart, let's start looking at, other tall tale signs that they were very intelligent?
Yeah, so let me start that by saying that I know several folks who focus on Neanderthals as their main source of study, and I don't know a single current Neanderthal researcher who doesn't view them as a complex, intelligent species. Um, and so but it's not something that's popularized. It's something among researchers that is kind of understood. And when I taught at the university, I actually did a whole 2-hour lecture on this, on the evolution of Neanderthals in our modern view of them. And start out with there's a just a fantastically horrible 50s horror film called The Neanderthal Man. If you haven't had a chance to watch it this Halloween season. Okay. You won't regret it. And it's one of those kind of, classic 50s horror where guy gets exposed to Neanderthal blood or something, something triggers his inner Neanderthal to come out. And just, it's basically the same as werewolf stories or anything else.
All right.
But it's hilarious, it's because the movie poster is all about his primitive desires and all this stuff. And I think that gets at the heart of what happened with Neanderthals. So, first Neanderthal found in 1856, 3 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species. And it was the first human relative found as well. And when that skull was brought out and people saw that low brow with those real prominent ridges, no chin, they thought this thing is so different than us, so primitive compared to modern humans. And so that started that bias where it was it was the only one in existence. I mean, if it had been the other way around and folks had found some of the early hominin stuff and then Neanderthals, I think our popularized view of them would be completely different. People would be talking about how complex they were and what big brains they had. But instead it was, it's so primitive compared to humans, this thing. And of course, right away, some of the first artist renditions were of them hunched over, right? They couldn't stand up fully and be like a good modern man and stand upright. Put the club in their hand, living in a cave, kind of, and the fact that the first Neanderthal was found in the Neander Valley in a cave site just compounds that. But it all of that to a Victorian English speaking person, which is the center of human studies at that time, all of that sounds like, the most primitive possible life you can have. And so that really laid that groundwork, and it took over a century to break out of that, of people, because you're right, scientists went in with their own biases and were limited in what they were looking for a long time. And then researchers started finding things like, potential intentional burials at Neanderthal sites. The evidence of potential care for one another, where you have an individual that fractured their leg all the way through. There's no way that person is walking on that leg, yet it calcified and they survived for years afterwards. Yeah. Somebody had to bring them food.
Right.
And so all sorts of evidence of that. And over the years, our view of Neanderthals has changed. And, I jokingly brought up the Geico commercials, but there's a great example of pop culture of our view of Neanderthals changing. It's so easy a caveman can do it, insults the guy.
Yeah.
Where, and he's working a complex job, or he's ordering duck a l'orange, and they're saying it's so easy a caveman can do it. And so our view has changed over time as the science has changed. And now we have, pretty clear evidence of all sorts of everything from a pretty complex toolkit. I mean, that was the other thing, is that people used to think their toolkits were really simple. Right. And now we know that they were, 6 to 8 times more complex than the hominin before them. Excuse me.
No, that's fine. If you need to take a drink, you can take a drink. It's no big deal. I don't. If you need to, it's okay.
Oh, I'm okay. So yeah, we've got this, and it has changed over time. And there's a great image from a Time Life series of the Neanderthal male coming out of the cave with this dragging his club, and there's like a woolly rhino in the background, and it looks like the males are going to go off and hunt, and the only female in the picture is this old looking woman who looks like could be their mom or something, and it's like 3 males that are gonna go kill a woolly rhino. And years later, someone did a modern version of that with all the interpretations that have happened of Neanderthal culture since then. And the central figure is a woman, and she's got a baby hanging on her, and she's explaining something to the rest of the group. And the most prominent male is butchering an animal while he's also got a kid hanging on him. And it's a much more egalitarian, almost female focused view. And I think that that's probably romanticized as well, right? It's you kind of like, I think of things as the pendulum swinging back and forth, and it swung way too far to one side, now it's swung way too far to the other, and it needs to settle in the middle. And that's kind of where we're getting at. And I think a lot of the researchers are already there. They're seeing, okay, the Neanderthals are really these complex, lived in these complex groups. They had far more varied cultures than what we would think of them as having. And we now know that our ancestors interbred with them, so they couldn't have been that primitive.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
our ancestors saw them as potential mates. So so I think we're getting there, but it's one of those unfortunate things in anthropology where we had this stuck in our heads for so long about the quintessential caveman is what I like to refer to them as. And this idea of these brutes that are kind of barely scratching out an existence, almost as if they were waiting for modern humans to come along so they could die out because they just weren't going to make it. And that's just so far off from what was really going on.
Yeah. So there's a couple things here. So let's take a step back. Studying the chimpanzees and everything. A question, if you want to answer, what theories of evolution do you believe then? I know there's some that say we were evolved from, the monkeys or whatever, what have you, what kind of, what would your opinion be on evolution?
Okay. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's very clear to even your most sort of skeptical scientist, biologist, that evolution is just fact. It is what happens to populations as they move through time on this planet. And that really gets at the core of the simplest kind of heart of evolution, is that evolution is just change in allele frequencies or gene types in populations over time. And so every population changes, and if you have enough time, those populations are going to change drastically, or if you have really strong selective pressures, they're going to change drastically. So that time can be shortened with an intensity of selection. But yeah, that's the first thing. And I like to think of that as, in my mind, that's a really reassuring thing, because we now understand a core part of how nature works. So when you see swallows' nests in the spring, and babies who have been pushed out and before they were ready to fly, if you understand evolution, you understand that those parents produced more offspring as a buffer because some babies weren't going to make it.
Okay.
And so to me, it's kind of a very reassuring thing of understanding how nature works. Again, I move through my life in with this knowledge of not putting any value judgments on those things. Like, those baby swallows I just referred to, most of them are pushed out by their own siblings in what is called siblicide. And I don't think, boy, that's a really mean big brother or big sister. That's just how the competition works.
Yeah.
In our case, it's very clear from the evidence we have that modern humans, evolved from earlier ape ancestors, not monkeys. Monkeys are actually a younger lineage than the apes are. The modern day monkeys are, and we didn't evolve from any of the existing apes. We evolved from an extinct ape species, and those existing apes have gone on their own evolutionary trail. So they've gone down their own evolutionary path, and none of them is what we evolved from. Some of them make a better kind of proxy model than others, but none of them are 100% what we evolved from. And then the other part is that humans are still evolving. So there's no endpoint in evolution. It's just how populations change to their environments over time. And so humans are still evolving. We have some instances of that in almost kind of real time.
Yeah.
We're probably seeing one of those strong selective pressures with the COVID situation, considering it's a worldwide impact on human populations. But that's also an important thing, I think, for people to remember, because it means that our population is changing. There's no sort of, we got to the finish line and we're done, because there is no finish line.
Yeah. Awesome. That was awesome. Loved it. Thank you very much. So, just a couple more questions here. I don't know how much longer you have, or if you don't have any more time, that's fine. I just had two more things I wanted to ask, but it's up to you.
Oh no, fire away. We're good.
So, one of the okay, let's go with and you may not be able to answer it. And it's okay. What do you think would be the best trait that we inherited from our Neanderthal cousins or early human ancestors? It's a heck of a question. I've never asked that. So,
so I mean, it's important for us to remember that we did get some traits from Neanderthals. Probably nothing that is like, going to dominate the human population, given the percentage of Neanderthal genes that are in different human populations. But I would say from our earlier ancestors, probably the most important thing goes back to that behavioral flexibility, of humans being able to, I mean, if you think about humans today, we are, and this is even pre-jet airlines, jet airplanes and everything else, we are on every single continent naturally, except Antarctica. And, talk about a niche situation. It's only a few species that can survive in Antarctica, right, without special accommodations. And we're definitely not one of those, but we're on every continent. And that's not by mistake. That's not by, humans took a right turn when they meant to turn left and they ended up in Asia. That's from the population expanding naturally because of our behavioral flexibility. We've been able to occupy all of those continents and all of those different latitudes all those different, you know, we were just you and I are at the beginning of this, we're just talking about which hemisphere we're in and what the weather's like. We've been able to go in all those different environmental conditions with only changing our behavior, not changing our physical structure drastically. Now, yes, there are, you know, for example, the Maasai. Sorry, dogs are barking in the background.
That's okay.
One of the things that we've co-evolved with is our domesticated dogs when they domesticated themselves. But you know, the Maasai in East Africa are on average, men are, I think, 6'2", 6'3". And they're very long, and they're very lean built. I was fortunate enough to spend some time with some Maasai folks and do a little bit of work with them, and they used to laugh at me all the time because I am not built for a tropical savanna environment.
Yeah.
And they would all laugh and say, "Oh, you know, you're gonna die out here if you don't have a good hat and a lot of water." And but then, you know, and then of course there are folks in northern latitudes who have very relatively short appendages, and so we have some of that variation in population. So I don't want it to seem like there hasn't been any kind of localized adaptation to populations. You know, high altitude populations with their lung capacities expanded, different situations there. But the biggest difference between those communities is how much clothes they wear. It's when they decide to be exposed to the elements. It's what foods they eat that allow them, you know, if you're in a northern latitude and you're eating an incredibly high fat diet that's allowing you to store energy and burn extra energy while you're getting through these cold times, that's very different than the very lean and largely plant-based diet that most of your tropical populations are on. All of those things are changes that really we've done just with our culture, just with our behavior. And so, if we want to talk about the most important thing, it would be that relatively large brain and that behavioral flexibility that I think our ancestors must have had to pass it down to us.
Awesome. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to use that more often. That was pretty good. I like the answer. I appreciate it. It was good.
That was a good one. I like that one.
So then let's I guess jump back a little further too with now what in your opinion would be the most significant discovery of all and of recent with our Neanderthal cousins or ancestors?
Oh wow. Now this is where my bias comes in, because I really focus on really early hominin behavioral reconstructions when I look at human evolution. So I like the stuff like 5.5, 6, 7 million years ago. And so there's the classic in Australopithecus afarensis and Lucy, that I think was, if you were to say this one is the most important, Lucy probably would still be that, just in the sense of she's 3.5, 4 feet tall, 75% complete skeleton that clearly showed this crazy little biped thing walking around on two legs that wasn't an ape as we see them today and wasn't a human as we see them today. It was something else. But recent stuff, I would say that the Ardipithecus remains, so that stretches our ancestry back another million or another 2 million years to 5.5. I think the oldest stuff they have is about 5.8 million years old. And there again, they've been able to do a reconstruction showing, most of this thing that again is a biped, but is a different biped than Lucy was. So Lucy had a little more of a stride. This thing was more of a waddler when it walked. That I think is really significant. But then if you were to want to talk about, see, this is why biological anthropology, it's hard to pin things down because there's so many different areas.
Sure.
You know, you could talk about what we talked about earlier about the muddling of that time period of humans evolving, Neanderthals evolving, Denisovans or whatever those were being around, and all those populations kind of mixing with each other, and you having this big kind of messy melting pot of hominins. And we've got one species that emerged out of that survived, but therefore probably 50 plus thousand years, probably closer to over 100,000, you had these separate populations that when they came together, they could make babies, they could they could interbreed, and they survived independently for a long period of time. But now we've got this one population, so that to me is really revolutionary. And then the last thing I would mention is this most recent stuff. The I don't know if you saw the pictures of the fossilized footprints.
Yes.
You know, if those dates check out, quite honestly, I'll be honest with you, 21,000 years ago doesn't surprise anyone who has spent any time studying the peopling of the Americas, because there's evidence along the Kelp Highway, which is what they call off the Pacific coast, the kind of those kelp regions that are really high in resources and things. People boating down those and living on places like the Channel Islands, and that stretching back to maybe 18,000 years ago. So 21,000 wouldn't shock anyone who has been studying it, but it pushes that earliest agreed upon date way back. And I think for thinking about, especially with some of the issues around Native Americans today and, you know, their claims for ancestral homeland and things like that, it really impacts all of that. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I always, that was awesome that they had discovered those footprints. And like, even with me, I always struggle with there had to be someone here before the Native Americans. I mean, there just had to be. We were part of this big world that was being occupied by our Neanderthals and our Homo sapiens, and I mean, there had to be. In my mind, it just seemed like there had to be lives here, earlier than what we think.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of two separate parts there. I think earlier than we think, sure. I think it's also hard for us to imagine, I mean, especially with North America, how developed it is today, in the areas that you see. I mean, if you go where you're at, if you just go north the ways and go to Cleveland, that sprawling rock and roll city, we'll see how the Browns end up doing this year. You got, I mean, just there, and like you said, you're just west of Pittsburgh. I mean, I spent a little time in Pittsburgh, and it's not the most sprawling city I've ever been in, but it's a big city, and to think of how developed those are, I think sometimes it's hard for us to imagine a time where humans weren't around. But also that's a really exciting thought experiment to go on sometime. Of imagine North America with no Homo sapiens on it, and then when these people showed up, because that's almost certainly the case, is that you had a time where there weren't any humans, and then all this fauna that had evolved here gets exposed to this thing that has sticks that fly through the air and hurt a lot. and fire to scare you away and to burn up your forests and things. It's yeah, I mean it definitely it happened. It just is when is going to be the question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see. And I think finding those footprints, again, like we were talking earlier, took their minds out of that box of, well, we were pretty sure this is when they arrived, but now we have this evidence that it was a lot sooner than what we think. So now, it's exciting that now that their minds are a little more open, that there's probably going to be more discoveries, so that's exciting to see.
Absolutely. And again, let me just say this really quickly. It's again another great example of this is how science works. We used to think 12,000 years ago, Clovis points, that was the earliest that humans were here. Then they found evidence, we found the original running shoes in Oregon, 11 to 12,000 year old sandals. And they're like, oh, well, that was a well-established home area, so had to be earlier than that. Then we found jewelry from 15,000. And now we found these footprints that may be 21,000 years old. And each time, the new data required us to rethink the situation and expand our minds and say, okay, let's open up our minds to the possibility that what we thought was the case, now we've got new data and that's no longer the situation. And that's how science works. That's one of the biggest challenges I think we have with scientific experiments and research today, is that people want that final answer, right? They want scientists to tell them, well, tell me exactly when it happened. Tell me exactly how it happened. That isn't how science works at all.
Yeah.
We say, based on the data, this is what the evidence shows. And we are always ready as scientists to completely throw out everything that we knew when new data is presented to us.
It's exciting times. It really is. And just the year that I've been doing this podcast, there's just been so many new discoveries, and I'm so grateful that I got into it at the time that I wanted to get into, because I don't have any experience in Neanderthals or anthropology, none of that. It was just me wanting to learn about it. And I mean, it's just been fascinating. This past year journey, it's been very fascinating. So,
well, I was going to ask you what got you into this, because it's an interesting, it's an interesting area for someone to dive into. And I gotta commend you in that regard, because I think there are a lot of people that, once they hit 30, they stop learning. And
yeah.
and it's unfortunate, because what we were just talking about when you asked me the most significant thing we inherited from our ancestors, and I said our behavioral flexibility, that creativity, that comes from learning new things.
Yeah.
And so it's ironic that there are a lot of people out there who have basically just shut the door on what is one of the essential things that makes us human.
Yeah.
And you've gone just the opposite. You're like, I want to know about this, so I'm going to start a forum where I can bring people in and find out. That's awesome. So yeah, well done, man.
It was definitely a deep dive. I just because I was always about mindfulness, and I was, my mom, I was a mama's boy, and she was always a people watcher, just watching. So I developed this watching people, and then it's just like, well, why did that person just do that, or why did they react that way? And I heard someone say on a podcast one time that a lot of what we think or feel was because of our Neanderthal ancestors or cousins. And I thought, well, you know what? If that's the route, then that's the route I'm going to go, because I want to know why we act like we do. So I just figured I'd take a leap in and learn along the way. So
that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to get to the end of this, Dr. Sherrow, first off, I absolutely appreciate you being willing to come on and talk to someone who has no knowledge whatsoever about Neanderthals and teach me quite a few things. I greatly appreciate that. And I know my cave dweller community appreciates everything you everything you gave us today. But before we go, is there anything that we didn't discuss that you would like to talk about?
I think the last thing I would want to mention is that there are a couple of books out there today, brand new stuff that they really claim to, we can help you solve your modern day problems by looking at things through a prehistoric lens, the way your ancestors would have. Um, I put those into the same category as I put something like the paleo diet.
Okay.
It's these claims that all of our ancestors acted a certain way or ate a certain thing, or this is how you have to do it if you want to. The reality in the paleo diet is it probably was a lot of scavenged meat, a ton of plant material, and then a bunch of bugs mixed in there. And so, the idea that the paleo diet is, well, I'm going to go eat moose that's barely cooked and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. It's all fantasy. And so I would just say to the cave dwellers, right? Keep a skeptical mind when you come across these things, because it can be really exciting to someone who's really curious about this, but hasn't had the opportunity to study it. Oh, look, this book has all the answers in it. And no, they don't. They're really expressing their opinions.
Yeah.
Some are better than others, and they're all designed to make money off of selling the book and the book tour. And that's no fault to the authors. That's a perfectly legitimate route to go. Is I'm going to write a popular science book, and I'm gonna get the proceeds off of it. Great, awesome. My concern with those always is when people think that, these guys, they've got doctor in front of their name or PhD behind their name, and they're saying that this is how it happened, so that must be the case. Nah, just keep your skeptical mind, and when something kind of seems weird, look into it. And honestly, scholar.google.com is a great place for folks to just be able to jump on and see, has anyone written a paper about this? Is there a peer-reviewed scientific study? And yeah, that's the last little thing that I'd throw out there.
Awesome. Now,
and I want to thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you have any books or any papers you want to promote or anything?
I'm got a book in the works right now that's about cults and how cults evolve and why they evolve and why they persist. But and then through my website, the uevolving.com, I've got a blog that I do on Psychology Today that's linked through there. So I do a semi-regular blog for Psychology Today, looking at human behavior and why we potential reasons why we do certain things. So lots of online writings. I've got a podcast as well. It's just You Evolving. And I'll send you the link to that. But yeah, and if any of your listeners want to know more, I'm always happy to answer emails, and there's contact form through the website. So it's really easy.
Yeah, I'll definitely put all your links and everything in the show notes so that they can get to them without a doubt. But again, Dr. Sherrow, thank you so much. It's been awesome. It's been a fantastic conversation, and man, I greatly appreciate it. And look, any time in the future that if you have anything you want to come on and talk about, send me an email and I'll get you on as soon as possible. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Thanks. It's been fun.
All right, Dr. Sherrow, have a good evening. Enjoy that beautiful evening that it looks like you're having right now, and hopefully we'll talk to you again in the future.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.